After Steve Jobs' death, his sister Mona Simpson spoke about her brother's last words. Before leaving, he said several times, "Oh wow." Believers see in these dying words a sign that Jobs could see through the veil of our world in the last minutes of his life, and what was revealed to him was truly wonderful. Skeptics consider these exclamations to be just a hallucination of a dying person, and one could agree with this if such a case were an isolated one. Thomas Edison's contemporaries claimed that before his death, the inventor uttered, "It's very beautiful there." And the last word of the writer Hannah Mohr was joy. Such examples were given by David Kessler in one of his speeches. Journalists awarded him the title of Chief Expert on Death and Grief. In fact, David Kessler is a certified medical psychologist with a master's degree in bioethics. Kessler considers mercy to be the most important principle of this science, including for terminally ill and dying people. He calls himself a researcher of death in all its forms and follows death wherever it happens. Therefore, his work includes several areas: helping the dying in hospitals and hospices, volunteering in the disaster and accident relief team, as well as psychological support for crime victims and their loved ones. In addition, David writes articles and books, gives interviews, and holds numerous meetings across the country with those who are interested in life and death issues. In order to answer the questions of grieving relatives and help them cope with their loss, a psychologist has created a website, grief.com, which is visited annually by over 5 million people from all over the world. David Kessler collaborated with renowned psychiatrist Elisabeth Kübler-Ross. She devoted her life to caring for the dying, as well as researching near-death experiences. She believed that death is just a stage of life, and you need to be prepared to face it with dignity and calmness. Elisabeth advocated for a change in the attitudinal staff towards hopeless patients. Even during her residency at the Manhattan State Hospital in the late 50s of the last century, she was struck by the indifference and disregard with which doctors treat the needs of such patients. It was then that the psychiatrist began to develop a program that would focus on individual care and attention to each patient. All American hospices still organize their work based on this methodology. The hospice team not only provides patient care, but also works with the patient's family, providing them with comprehensive support. Relatives usually do not cope well with the emotions and responsibilities associated with the death of a loved one. One of the most important aspects of the work is guiding the patient and his family through the dying process, helping everyone concerned recognize the signs of death, tell them what they mean, what to expect in the future, and how to prepare for the final journey. Kübler-Ross considered death to be a transition to another state. She believed in an afterlife and believed that after death, people become full-fledged. The blind can see, the deaf can hear, and the crippled cease to be crippled, because all their injuries cease to exist. 10 years of communication and collaboration with a staunch supporter of the theory of eternal life have finally shaped the psychologist's life position. After Kübler-Ross's death, David Kessler published his first personal study, which included dozens of visions and statements from dying people. Some of these episodes were witnessed by David Kessler himself, while others were recorded by him from the words of doctors and hospice volunteers. She started talking to someone no one else could see. David Kessler was 32 years old when he became interested in working in the field of care for the terminally ill. He began not only caring for hospice patients, but also conducting research in the field of trauma and loss psychology. David Kessler focused on the grieving process, especially for parents who have lost children. However, after working in a hospice for several months, Kessler had to expand his field of activity and begin an equally important analysis of data related to visions in the last days of life of hopeless patients. My first experience with deathbed visions was with a woman named Dora. Dora struggled with the disease for a long time and successfully, but eventually she began to lose ground. In the last week of her life, she alternated between losing consciousness and regaining consciousness. During the first vision, she was half asleep, but then suddenly regained clarity of consciousness and began talking to someone whom no one else in the room could see, says David Kessler. From that day on, Dora began to stare at nothing more often. as if the visitors and staff were transparent. Looking through them, the woman was having a conversation with invisible guests. When Dora's illness reached a critical point, she began to talk only to her dead mother. "Mom, is that you? Mom, you're back," she said in the presence of David and her relatives. Those who watched this were amazed. There was no doubt in the minds of those present that the terminally ill woman was seeing her mother. Dora's voice was so sincere and joyful that Kessler had the urge to turn his head to look at the person Dora was addressing, even though he knew he wouldn't see anyone there. Dora's daughter, Myra, was upset at first when she heard her mother talking to her grandmother. But then she got excited listening to her mother describe the invisible guest's outfit. According to Dora, the clothes consisted of light, and it hurt her to look at them. Myra, who had not seen the vision, realized that her mother was dying and simply told her, "I love you." It seemed to bring Dora back to reality for a moment, and she looked into her daughter's eyes and said, "I love you too." Immediately after that, Dora started talking to her invisible mother again. It seemed to those present that the patient herself was struck by this vision, no less than others. Dora was surprised that her late mother was in this room and was dressed in such shining clothes that she had to squint when looking at her. Here's a quote from Kessler's book, Visions, Trips, and Crowded Rooms: Who and What You See Before You Die. "I will never forget the day Dora died. I have no doubt that she really saw her mother before she died. This vision seems to me to be a natural development of events. Our parents are waiting for us on the other side and showing us the way. Now this idea seems completely reasonable to me." Over time, I've noticed that such visions are very comforting to patients, and I will always remember Dora and the peace she felt when she looked at her mother, dressed in bright clothes. Dora's near-death visions were the first, but far from the only such case. In David's archives, you can find other records collected over many years of monitoring hospice patients. A patient who was dying of cancer was very restless all night. In the morning, she fell asleep, but soon opened her eyes and stared intently at the corner of the room where no one was. She said, "Mom, I'm so glad to see you." And she smiled. The relatives who were present physically felt the tense atmosphere in the room dissipate. After this comment, the patient died peacefully. A 52-year-old woman was dying from a failed transplant. She was afraid of death and often said that she would never surrender to it without a fight. 2 days before she died, she started looking over my shoulder and smiling at whoever was standing behind me. There was no one there. I asked the patient who she was talking to, and she replied that she was talking to her dead father. Then she said, "Okay, fine. It's okay. I'm not afraid anymore." Then she passed away, and the smile remained on her face. It was so nice to see that the poor woman finally found peace. An elderly woman started talking to her mother and brother. Both of them were already dead. She talked to them all the time, and then she smiled contentedly and fell asleep. Finally, in the last conversation with them, she agreed that it was time to go home and died on the same day. A 67-year-old woman saw her husband, who died 4 years ago. He came to her with his beloved dog, who had already died. She stated that her husband took her by the hand and said that he and his faithful four-legged friend would show her the way she had to walk to die peacefully. The man talked to his deceased parents for several days in a row. Then one afternoon he turned to me and smiled, so peaceful. He looked at the ceiling and said, "I'm going back home. This place is so beautiful. There are lights and clouds everywhere." Then he died. The elderly woman felt worse for several days. She barely regained consciousness, and suddenly she sat up in bed, opened her eyes, and said, "How beautifully the lights are burning." Her family was by her side and asked her to go to the lights. She agreed and died a few minutes later. As a doctor, I witnessed interesting things, especially when I was working in a hospice. In his research, David Kessler cites the story of a doctor named John, who also works at a hospice. John says that the first time he witnessed visions was when he worked as a family doctor. He talks about a family he has known for many years. John was present at the births and deaths that took place in this family. "I was present at the death of the head of this house. His wife and son were with him when he died. 10 years later, the man's widow Regina, was dying of congestive heart failure. Regina was close to her children and grandchildren, especially after her husband's death. Despite her serious illness, she still found the strength to attend the graduation of her eldest grandson. But it soon became clear that her condition was rapidly deteriorating. All this time, Regina was under my supervision. One day, I noticed that this woman started talking to someone who was clearly not around, says John. Regina's relatives were convinced that she was hallucinating because of the medication. They asked the doctor to cancel these medications. But the withdrawal of medications did not change anything in Regina's behavior. One day, she announced to her son, who was sitting by her bed, that she was seeing his father. The woman continued talking to her late husband for several minutes, and then she seemed to switch over, return to reality, and engage in a completely coherent conversation with her family. The patient's moments of enlightenment were becoming less frequent, but each time she continued conversations with an invisible visitor. After one of them, she quietly fell asleep and never woke up again. One of my patients, who was dying of kidney cancer, called me to his place and asked me to tell him honestly what was going to happen to him soon. I sat down next to him and calmly explained that he didn't need to be afraid of pain. Most often, death occurs during sleep, because in recent days, most of the day people either sleep or are in between sleep and wakefulness. To die here on earth does not mean to fall into oblivion. Only the body will die, and the spirit will simply enter a new world. As a doctor, I witnessed interesting things, especially when I worked in a hospice. I've lost count of how many times I've heard a dying patient say, "I saw my spouse, child, friend." People often ask me why doctors don't talk about visions. I explain that there are reasons for this, John notes. According to John, doctors don't spend too much time alone with patients at the end of their lives. They come for a quick assessment and see how they can manage a particular symptom in order to alleviate the general condition of the patient. Doctors are trained to treat and help, that is, purely material things, so visions on their deathbed are easier for them to attribute to hallucinations. However, more experienced doctors may perceive these visions as a sign of impending death. People see dead relatives, pets, close friends, says the doctor. These visions bring them comfort. The deceased sometimes come to patients in their dreams, but most often when they are fully conscious and sane. As a rule, invisible visitors say something like that. "I'll come for you soon. You don't have to worry." It sounds scary, but I can say that in 100% of cases, people are comforted after such visions. They seem to understand what's going to happen next, and it gives them a sense of comfort. I've seen many patients who couldn't accept death, and then they had visions and they calmed down. And it's not even about religion. Relatives visit both deeply religious and atheists. Although people who found the meaning of life in God left the easiest, this is a real doctor's observation, and there is no difference whether they are Christians or Muslims. These are the brightest people, the kindest. They have peace in their hearts. John admits that several times patients saw their deceased relatives right during a conversation with him. "You won't believe it, but I literally see my father here right now," he recalls one man saying. And John really believes that all this is not the nonsense of sick people. Why? He told me that he heard his dying brother talking to his long-dead grandmother. As a doctor, it's very easy for me to ignore such things until you see them with your own eyes. Could my brother's vision have been a dream or a hallucination? This may be true, but a hallucination is just something undetectable by the five senses. That doesn't mean it's not real. Anything is possible, but for me and my mother, none of these options seemed right. It was very deep, but real. None of us wanted to interfere in what was happening, so we just watched. Most of John's colleagues never discuss such things and never admit their reality openly. They prefer to write off all the visions as side effects from medications or near-death damage to brain cells. John was the same until he started working in a hospice. Here he had more time to just sit with his patients and get to know them. At the hospice, John witnessed how many of his patients saw visions before they died, and they always seemed to bring peace to the patient's soul and reconcile him to his imminent demise. John does not consider these visions to be something phenomenal. I have been caring for the dying in a hospice for many years, and I want to share one interesting observation. I've never heard a dying man say, "Nothing is happening. Now I can't see anything. I'm going to nothing." If there is nothing behind the veil of our world, then why do dying people say otherwise? And if that's the case, then I'd rather believe the words of people standing at death's door than the doubts of the living who have never been present at their demise. John admits that he really believes in life after death. Therefore, he is not afraid to die. Do you believe that death is just a passage to another world? Write your opinion in the comments. Maybe you have some interesting story that you would like to share. Write it in the comments below the video, and I and the viewers of the channel will be happy to read it. Dear friends, thank you for watching my video to the end. If you liked it, please like it, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. It's very important. Thank you, and have a nice day.